Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are dialing in to today's webinar from the Center for Strategic Philanthropy inside the Judge Business School at Cambridge University here in the UK. So we are delighted to have you all join us. We'll just give everybody a couple of minutes to dial in while I give you a short background to the center. So as I said, we are of course inside the University of Cambridge. Our center is focused on strategic philanthropy in the global south, in emerging markets, looking specifically at the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Africa. Today's seminar is the fifth in a series, the series that we have been running, supporting the movement Shift the Power. And today's seminar will be looking specifically at local voices and local needs. So this has been a topic that has been high on the agenda of many organizations in the recent past. And it's something that essentially underpins the work that we have done at the center since our establishment nearly 2 years ago. Based on some of the shifts that we have seen happening in emerging market philanthropy, where indeed our own research that we published last year, our COVID-19 report, absolutely suggested that there were shifting dynamic between the global south and the global north in terms of how philanthropic capital is dispersed, one that we felt it was important to explore further. And hence the creation of this series to really try to bring to light, if there is a shift in the power dynamic, what does that mean? And what would we like donors to do? How would we like donors to act differently? What is happening in the global south? Specifically, we want to look at the impact of philanthropic capital coming into emerging markets, coming into the global south, in terms of how it affects local communities, in terms of how it affects allocation of resources on the ground. And we will be addressing the various issues that I'm sure all of our panelists and many of our participants will be aware of, that where that pain point of where philanthropic capital hits really grassroots local communities, what actually happens and how can we address some of the challenges in that space. So delighted to have three excellent panelists with us this morning, who I will introduce shortly, and in particular Riva, who I'll introduce shortly, but from the Radical Flexibility Fund, who actually helped us create the idea for this webinar series. Again, as I said, this is a fifth in the series. This is the last one for 2021. We will be picking up on the series next year. The Radical Flexibility Fund, who you will hear more about later, was very helpful in helping us to curate this discussion and debate and bring to the fore some of the challenges around notably control over funding and how it's used, and control over reporting, the energy expended on control and accountability, and how we can redirect that to locally empowering communities, and particularly what happens when the community has the power to identify the goals of an intervention rather than the donors? How can donors become charged with enforcing the rules and standards of the community rather than imposing their own standards? So I think that from RFF really kind of sums up the direction of this discussion today, looking at how we empower local voices, how we help donors learn more about what is actually required, what are the local needs. We have heard recently some news from Hewlett-Packard's Madison initiative, where they themselves, and many others, I should say, this is just one example, have been listening to this discourse over the last couple of years and have recognized that they need to change the way they respond to local voices and local needs. They actually cited recently in the press release that they put out on their new approach, their new methodology. They said, we came to appreciate that the budgets and metrics we were getting from our grantees were in effect artificial, created solely for proposing and reporting on our grants. Grantees were not using them in their day-to-day work. Then our grant officer reported on the aggregate impressions from her confidential interviews with grantees, and we got an earful. And based on that conversation, they said they have simplified with 3 principles. So I thought these principles were very relevant to our discussion. Number 1, asking the local grantee what success for you looks like in the longer term. Not what do we think successful, what does it look like for you? Number 2, what are some of the indicators that you would use to assess your progress? And how are you already tracking those to ensure that they are relevant and useful? The third principle that they're going to be using is what potential developments or challenges, internal or external, could make it harder to realize the long-term vision that we are creating together. So I just thought that was a great example of quite a structural shift and really that mind shift change in the way we think about who's calling the shots, who is actually dictating how we measure, how we scale up, how we identify the opportunity, and how we allocate precious resources. I hope that's kind of set the context for today's discussion. A little bit on housekeeping. So obviously we're going to be here for an hour and a half. And yes, we can put the principles in the chat, bear with me, and I'll do that shortly. Going to be here for an hour and a half. If you need to jump off early, then please do come back and revisit the discussion via our YouTube channel, where we will of course be posting the entirety of the discussion. Please put your questions. So we want this to be interactive. I will be discussing with our panelists first, and then we will absolutely open up the floor for further input. But please put your questions in the Q&A, because we want this to be about democratic power dynamics. So you have the option to vote up your questions in the Q&A. And please do check out our social media accounts at Cambridge CSP for Twitter and the Center for Strategic Philanthropy via LinkedIn. This is part of a conversation that we want to continue. So delighted to have with me today, first of all, Dr. Riva Kantowitz, who is the founder of the Radical Flexibility Fund, as I mentioned, and so much more. Secondly, Dr. Osili, who is the Associate Dean of Research and International Programs at the Lilly Philanthropy School of Philanthropy. And thirdly, Maria Anik Tunjung Wusari, who is the board member and former executive director for Indonesia for Humanity. And before I come to their profiles in more detail, I just wanted to say that what is brilliant about the 3 of them is that they all have had academic careers. They have lectured, they've done research, they've been practitioners, and all 3 of them are powerful leaders in their own right in this space. And we sadly don't have Middle East representation today. We unfortunately lost our 4th speaker from the Middle East, Dr. Samia Al-Botme, due to very specific Palestinian circumstances, and we're hoping to re-engage her in future events. More broadly, I think we have insights and expertise here from across our core markets, obviously Middle East being one of them, but also Africa and Southeast Asia. And I'm sure that our speakers will talk to their experience in those markets. Just a quick background to the series that I think it's important to mention. So we didn't invent Shift the Power, of course. We actually wrote our COVID-19 report, and after we had written it, we're kind of adopting that kind of terminology in our report, and then discovered that others had been doing it long before us. So we decided that we wanted to be part of that movement. So Shift the Power was actually the title of various conferences that came out of the Global South, particularly from Sub-Saharan Africa and various powerful leading organizations in South Africa. And it then grew into a hashtag, and now it is a full-blown website, and increasingly a full-blown movement. So really, this is our effort to contribute to that, to building this momentum and continuing the movement. The 4 sessions that we've had thus far have looked, first of all, at the whole power dynamic. Secondly, we looked at moving beyond grants. Thirdly, we looked at how can we render philanthropic capital more flexible. And on our last session, we looked at transparency. And I would urge you all to go check those out on YouTube following today's discussions. Really, what we're trying to do here today and beyond is to support this movement. We believe it is getting traction, and I've no doubt we will hear that from our speakers today. So before we start, we're going to just pull up a poll. Hopefully, if technology is on our side, we're going to pull up a poll, and we'd just like to get some of your insights. And Riva, I hope you will appreciate how much I pulled some of these questions from the discussions we were having yesterday on your brilliant seminar, where you were talking about creating tools in this space. So forgive us for the plagiarizing, amended slightly, but I thought this might be helpful to the broader community and for your specific questions yesterday. So we wanted to ask, what is the most important element of the growing localization agenda? Is it about having people based locally? Is it about engaging those communities for decision making? Is it about securing local funding? Is it about asking local communities, how do we measure? Reference to Madison initiative that I spoke about earlier. So it is a bit of a complex poll, as Jack has pointed out to me. So we're going to give you a couple of seconds just to review those and vote accordingly. And I should say that the topic of localization, again, is not something new. We have been hearing this for several years, aligned with the discussions around the decolonization of philanthropy. And we have seen multiple organizations, many international NGOs, from Save the Children to Oxfam, to name just a few, who have quite explicit localization agendas. So let me just look at what your polling input has revealed. So people are saying, which is great, the most important element of the localization agenda is to engage with local communities for that decision making. And in second place, actually, sorry, equal first place, all of the above. So that's great. So I'm not sure that's helpful for your toolkit, Riva, but I think it gives us a kind of endorsement that we're on the right track here. So thank you everybody for contributing to our poll. And now let's kickstart the discussions. So first of all, Riva, I'd like to come first to you, because I think you're something of a culprit here in terms of creating this discussion and this debate. And of course, all the great work that you're doing at the Radical Flexibility Fund, which I'm sure you'll share with us more. And I know that really this is building on your own background in both philanthropy and broader development, with your particular focus on human rights, and that you are still engaged with multiple foundations in an advisory capacity. And historically have led teams at the US State Department. So you've got that public and private sector perspective. So what I wanted to ask you first, Riva, since you guys have been talking and writing about this a lot, how can donors be held more accountable? Not just about how and what they fund, but also about the end consequences and this interesting dilemma or issue of often unintended consequences that we see in local communities on the ground. People aren't necessarily able to foresee and often don't even get reported on later. We just stick to the top line metrics. So tell us a little bit more about RFF, and that's specifically around holding donors to account.
Sure, great. Thank you so much, Claire, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening from New York. It's great to be with you. Thank you to CSP for hosting such a fantastic discussion series, and I'm honored to be included, as Claire said, in this opposite of Manel this morning with such a distinguished group of very powerful women. So Radical Flexibility Fund is a fund that invests in new and diverse financial mechanisms that empower local organizations, allowing them to be more sustainable and thus have more impact. We believe that the heart of radicalizing anything is deep reflection on the status quo and analysis around where the levers of change are. And so to our discussion today, and to Claire's question around, how can donors be more accountable to local communities, in just some framing thoughts for our conversation, I wanted to focus on what I see as a major pain point, which is interesting that to reiterate Claire's language earlier, around how inclusive community processes and accountability processes where communities hold each other accountable get translated to donors. So in the current status quo, and Claire also referenced a working group that we are hosting with the NEAR Network on localized finance that we held yesterday. And some of this I also drew from our fantastic discussion. So I think some of our participants are with us also. So credit and kudos to all of the great thinkers in that group. in the current status quo, NGOs, it was observed in that conversation that NGOs try their best to make their case to funders, often being forced to filter their priorities or solutions to the social issues that they deem important to fit with donor priorities, and additionally speak to pervasive perceptions that are often lacking in evidence, I will note, amongst those donors. So risk aversion, concerns about corruption, this narrative about the lack of capacity at the local level. This creates an endless cycle of donor-imposed programming that doesn't speak to priorities in communities or how to actually solve them, and doesn't hold donors accountable to those priorities that communities themselves have identified. So how do we change this dynamic at this particular pain point, this point of inflection, the point where community priorities determined through their own processes, where they have systems to hold each other accountable, converge with donor behavior? And I think this can be done, as Claire noted. This is one of our main focuses at Radical Flexibility Fund. And I think our conversation today will take that up more specifically. But just to start us off and address the question, I wanted to offer 2 concrete suggestions, which come from 10 Radical Actions, which is on our website. And the first one is that donors can create a better set of criteria to evaluate the actions of who they fund. For example, in their funding panels, as they are rating applications, they can ask, are the people who are affected by a particular issue considered experts in addressing the issue? If not, why not? And to Claire's point, what are the potential unintended consequences of funding any particular actor, an INGO, one of the usual suspects, or a local organization as well? Of giving resources to that particular actor. So more considered, I've sat in hundreds of US government panels, and we've never taken up that question. So, just more deliberate exploration of those types of questions. And then second, donors can invest in processes that focus on creating more sustainable and autonomous resourcing pathways for local organizations. As Claire also mentioned in the beginning, when a community or group of stakeholders has the power to identify and fund their own goals, donors then become charged with enforcing the standards and priorities of that community rather than imposing their own standards, thereby shifting accountability to communities themselves. So I'll stop there. Hopefully that addresses that framing question, and I'll hand it back to Claire.
Thanks, Riva. Yeah, and it's great. It's very interesting. So it's really about mindset, right? And asking the right questions. It's fascinating how ostensibly and potentially simple this shift could be, and yet how we all struggle to do it. It reminds me of the discussions around the gender and unconscious bias. Just ask yourself a question: could a woman also do this? And yet, so often we miss those opportunities to ask the right questions and continue with the structures of the past. Mm-hmm. When you ask why, well, because we've always done that. But I think that's a really good starting point. Thank you for that, Riva, for really setting the context. So I want to come now to Una. So Una, you have also been working in this space for a very long time now and doing excellent work, both from the the academic research perspective, but also as a practitioner and looking at this issue of local communities, both within your professional work. Obviously, as you shared, you were raised in Nigeria, of Nigerian parentage, so you've kind of got your feet in both camps, which is great from the kind of the global North donor perspective, but also what's actually happening in communities, and sometimes in the case of Nigeria, often remote local communities. So I want to ask you a specific question, and ask you also to pick up on the point you mentioned earlier around the work you're doing with CARE. And looking at really spotlighting local leaders, which is again something that we have found through our series Shift the Power, that just amazing leaders that we weren't aware of thanks to this movement are now gaining profile and really voice, which is the essence of obviously what we'd like to see happen. So given your work championing philanthropy for development and most importantly data and indices, and particularly the global philanthropy tracker where you're looking at trends, and then the philanthropy environment, looking at how conducive are markets. Give us a little bit of insight on the macro, the structural impediment. So what is it that stops us from empowering local communities and having them have greater control over funding decisions?
Wonderful. Thank you, Claire. To all the panelists who've joined. I too am honored to be part of this very distinguished group of experts from all over the world, and I really want to thank our colleagues at Cambridge for hosting us today. It is a very important time to be having this discussion. We all know that it's not just one part of the world that's been affected by the global health crisis, the economic cascading effects of the COVID pandemic, and all over the world, very important discussions about racial and social justice. So that's the frame for today's conversation. With colleagues at the Lilly Family School over the past 4 or 5 years, we've been engaged in expanding research on global philanthropy. The umbrella term for the work that we do is called the Global Philanthropy Indices. And underneath that big umbrella, we have 2 projects: the Global Philanthropy Environment Index, which examines the enabling environment around philanthropy, and the Global Philanthropy Tracker that looks at cross-border flows. Now, I want to stress how even in our work, we have turned the model upside down and really engaged regional and local experts from around the globe. For the first Global Philanthropy Environment Index launched in 2018, we set out intentionally to find experts, grassroots leaders, researchers, policymakers who are on the front lines of data collection, research, but also practice around philanthropy. And all over the world, convene this group. We were able to them sometimes in local settings and also in global settings as well. So truly building a global network. And what we learned through that project, especially with the Global Philanthropy Environment Index, is that there's a real hunger and scarcity of data. And importantly, there's also an opportunity to really learn at the local level what's taking place. So I just want to share a few quick, key highlights as we think about how do we change the narrative and shift the power dynamic. With the Global Philanthropy Environment Index, we look at some specific aspects of the philanthropic setting. We look at the ease of operating. Experts around the world talk about how easy is it to operate a nonprofit. What about tax incentives? Cross-border flows, how easy is it to transfer resources across countries? What is the political environment like, the sociocultural environment? And finally, all of this aggregates up to a score for each country. In addition to the scores, there's also a very rich description of the country environment. As COVID unfolded last year, over the last 12 to 18 months, we were able to go back to many of these experts and say, what are you learning about the philanthropic environment? How is it changing? And what are the lessons that we can take forth from this moment to build a stronger, more vibrant and resilient philanthropic environment? And what was inspiring and truly, I think, very important and relevant for today's conversation is that there was a lot of similarity when you looked at sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia. Voices from around the globe, the Middle East, talked about, number one, the need for collaboration. And collaboration has mattered more than ever in the COVID pandemic and beyond, because the challenges facing communities cannot be handled by one single sector, and there's really a need to work together. So as we think about shifting the power, it's also building the kinds of infrastructure that facilitates that collaboration. The second recommendation was the need to engage grassroots organizations. We saw that loud and clear in the data. And the important reason for this is not only, so when we talk about shifting the power, it's also going back to the grassroots, the communities that are affected, and looking for the voices that are not typically at the table. We saw this especially even in the United States, where there is, with the racial and social justice movement, who are the leaders at the front lines of these movements, and are they part of our discussion? The third recommendation is the need for more flexible reporting requirements, flexible funding, and more unrestricted support. It's interesting because a lot of these recommendations are not specific to one country or one region, but really cross-cutting. So you can see that we're really addressing a very timely issue. And finally, as we think about shifting the power, philanthropy has an opportunity to really address longstanding disparities and lift up voices that have been underrepresented or marginalized. In fact, it's exciting to see that conversations that have been long overdue are being had. I mentioned growing up in Nigeria, we're having a lot in Nigeria, certainly discussing how is gender affecting the leadership path of many people in the NGO sector, but also looking at ethnic and racial disparities within countries and across regions. So I think if you take it together, the Shift of Power movement, there is certainly regional and local complexities, but what I think we can take from the voices of the experts around the world and in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, is there's a real moment today that probably did not exist and certainly hasn't existed in my time as a researcher, as an academic, where we can draw on the resilience of local communities, we can lift up new leadership, and really draw on the expertise of grassroots leaders who've been doing this work long before many of the global experts came, and will be in communities for the long haul. So I think there's a lot to be encouraged and inspired, certainly from the research. I think in this moment, we've seen that data can just be really powerful, and having the country narratives alongside the data can also be a lever for change. So I will stop here and turn it back to Clare.
Thank you so much, Una. I have a couple of points to say, but I just wanted to mention to Fuji, who posted in the Q&A where you can get the description of the principles. It's actually in the chat, Fuji, but I'm sure Kat can zip that over to the Q&A for you. So I think it's brilliant, Una, that all the points you were mentioning of some of your findings resonate with ours. So you're kind of one of our global counterparts. So I love the fact that I feel like planets are literally aligning. And as you say, notwithstanding the horrors of COVID, I think we are seeing traction in this space. Indeed, that was the finding of our report, that it may be early days, and now the challenge is to entrench that traction and that shift of power. But you mentioned the importance of collaboration and infrastructure, grassroots organizations, and flexible funding. And our findings, again, similar markets, Africa, Middle East, and Southeast Asia, notwithstanding local heterogeneity, we found across all of those markets, there was a need for investing in infrastructure, particularly networks and institutional connections. Actually, sorry, these were our 3 recommendations. So more investment in networks and institutions, more unrestricted funding, core funding, I think was the exact wording that we used in a very sophisticated fashion. And the 3rd recommendation was working with governments, which I think echoes your findings in that space of environments that are conducive and cross-border flows. Certainly from my experience in the Middle East and our recent research there, we find that it's actually pretty difficult to allocate capital, philanthropic capital, across borders. And yet on the back of COVID, there was something of an awakening of governments that, this philanthropy thing is actually pretty interesting and something that we can explore and maybe even create partnerships. So let's hope there is an opportunity there to trigger more improvement in the philanthropy environment. But now talking of grassroots communities, then that gives me a nice segue to Anik. So Anik, obviously you have been very involved in looking at local activism and local movements for social impact. So formerly as the director of Indonesia for Humanity, and now as a board member, you've been working with marginalized people to help fast track and create social transformation, and focused on gender. And you also work in grassroots capacity, but also with some pretty large institutions, such as the Forum for Indonesian Development. So I wanted to ask you specifically about the point that you were making when we interviewed you for our COVID-19 report way back in June 2020. And we were asking you about the impact of COVID on local communities. And you made the point that Indonesia for Humanity was getting more traction, was getting more conversations going with both the local business community, but also with government. The COVID crisis had in a way amplified your voice in being able to articulate the needs of local communities. Can you tell us a little bit more about this option of local funding, which we are hearing a lot about, people saying, well, if there's less funding coming from the global north, or it's not the right kind of funding, then let's just source funding locally, which sounds great in principle, but what does that actually look like on the ground?
Okay, thank you, Claire, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening from Indonesia, from everyone here. I have colleague from Indonesia for Humanity coming, thank you. So thank you very much for Center for Strategic Philanthropy to invite me to this forum. Before I try to respond to your question, Claire, please allow me to explain a bit about Indonesia for Humanity, or we call it IKA in Bahasa Indonesia. We established 25 years ago by Indonesian human rights activists as a grant-making institution, when at that time we managed and we distribute and monitoring the fund, and that time we are not yet doing the public fundraising. So the fund that we manage is coming from international donor organization, and we disburse is to, of course, not only for the NGO, because since in the beginning, IKA, or Indonesia for Humanity, commit to be in the movement and together with the victim of violence and human rights violence, we want to support their fight for social justice. So we try to make our fund, it's not a big fund, it's a small fund, but it's more flexible, even for community-based organization, for grassroots organization. But we cannot give to individual victim because we believe that we have to give to the organization because we believe change coming from the organization. So later, after the establishment, I think 11 years ago, we call ourselves as a civil society resource organization, and doing the public fundraising, trying to, what you say, trying to find a resource from inside our country, because we also see there is a trend of the decreasing of donor and fund from international, because the status of our country become middle income countries at that time. So when the first okay, so we in the beginning, so when I said we are civil society research organization, we are grant making, we are play a role as an intermediary organization. It's also reflect that Indonesia, I think, doesn't really have a clear description about what the organization like us doing. Even now, if you learn further, we are now getting more worried because the government itself doesn't understand what is this third sector, and then they try to make a regulation that put us in the same bucket with the mass organization and kind of that. So with other friends in Indonesia, we try to make an alternative voice to make our entity is more recognized by the government, but in the other side also give us more freedom to get resource. So when the first case of COVID in Indonesia coming in March 2020, sorry, of course our organization also impacted, and then I'm talking with more intensively with the board, and then we agree that we have to observe, but we don't have many time to observe, because all around and we see the environment around us need the support, and we see also our partner, the NGOs in local area also need support, while the donor that they have, we already heard that they also ask for a negotiation whether some of the budget can be reallocated to use, for example, to protect their staff while the staff doing or accompanying the victim of violence, a woman victim of violence, for example, or the victim of human rights violence. But I heard also that the donor refused it, and then so as a local and I can say it's an indigenous civil society resource organization. We agree that okay, and we commit to be more flexible. So we try also to bargain, to negotiate to our donor whether can we use some of the fund to help to provide the emergency protection protection tools to our local partners. Some of them, most of them are individual philanthropy from outside, actually, Claire. They are agree, but for the donor, the bigger donor, the bilateral donor, it's very difficult to give agreement to what we ask. So then we see what asset that we have. So when I said to you that we talk to the government, it's not about the fund, but we meet with the government from one of the ministry in Indonesia, and then because of the pandemic, I think this is also another trigger, because I heard from them also they already talk about how to create a fund for NGOs. But because of COVID, now it's what happened is the reverse. So the Ministry of Finance, for example, they are a bit reluctant to give a fund for NGO because I told you before that NGOs in Indonesia is not really recognized by the government. So, but I also see more flowing of local resource in terms of emergency assistance, or from the local communities that they are willing to support the neighborhood, and also they support the health staff who's really working hard during that time. But my reflection is how about our local partner who work for social justice issue, for the structural issue. Yes, we in the certain period we have a support also from others to give a mask or to give a hand sanitizer and everything, because it's more tangible. It's I call it is a caritative action. But how about the sustainability for the organization who work for social justice? It is more difficult for them to get the support. So I think yeah, I'm a bit optimistic in the beginning of the pandemic, when then we expect that we will have a different relation with the corporation, for example. But I think we have to see further whether this support can continue. But I don't say that I don't believe on the support from the local. We really believe on it because we have to believe that, and I know that Indonesia is actually a wealthy country. But the problem is, like Una saying before, we are not lucky enough to have regulation like 501 in the US, for example, to have a tax exemption. So yeah, sorry, Claire.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I just want to pick up on a couple of things you said. So thank you so much for that. And yeah, it's good to see that, you know, I hope you remain optimistic. It's clear that a lot of this kind of commitment to change at the beginning of the pandemic, where both the private sector and donors, everyone was kind of saying, yeah, absolutely, we're going to change the way we do things. And there was a lot of emergency response. And it's probably early days, of course, we're not out of the pandemic in most countries. I wonder how much of that initial appetite for change has actually been sustained. I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting about what you're saying now, Anik, and what you have said historically, you know, philanthropic capital, of course, is risk capital. It can, in principle, go and do the things that where others dare not tread. And yet the work that we've seen done by the OECD, for example, in their research and their data shows that actually most philanthropic capital coming from the global north going into development goes to health and education, and very little goes to human rights, social justice, local sector reform. I mean, we have seen, of course, governments really struggling to regulate philanthropic capital. On the one hand, because perhaps we ourselves in the sector have overcomplicated things, but also, of course, because in many markets with more, you know, autocratic regimes often see philanthropic capital as a part of civil society and hence a source of dissidence. However, it does seem that is starting to change very pragmatically as governments realize that quite simply they need more money, and philanthropy can not only bring innovation, but it can also bring more cash. But my question, I want to hand the question to Riva now, picking up on what you said, Anik. So the challenge is, however, coming back to the subject of our debate, local voices and local needs, and all of these commitments to radical change, are we actually seeing any radical change? So short of the Hewlett-Packard example that I shared earlier, and again, it's a conversation we had with your group yesterday around how can we make it radical? I mean, this really, if a global pandemic isn't enough to throw everything up in the air and make us think about things radically differently, then what is? So what are you seeing? Obviously, you've got a global remit, but particularly in the US, you know, of all those foundations who 18 months ago said, yeah, we're going to change, we're going to be more locally focused. Is that getting traction, or has everybody just defaulted back to business as usual?
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a good question. I feel optimistic about the answer. So although I think, as was noted, some of the traction around COVID and in the face of, you know, Black Lives Matter and these various movements, I think that has dissipated. And I think, you know, we're hitting against some of these structural issues that have been around for decades. I was having a conversation with a colleague yesterday who said, I think it's just bad faith on the part of donors, you know, that they don't want to invest in local organizations. And, you know, they believe these tropes about lack of capacity. I think we really need to just banish that narrative. And I don't think that at all. I don't think it's bad faith. And maybe this comes from my having sat inside of these systems, you know, an experience I'm really grateful for, because I see that it's not a monolith, you know, that the program officers who make these decisions, and we know up to some of the senior leadership in these organizations, also feel powerless to some extent. So I think, you know, part of the message I was trying to send in the framing, and one of the central ways that we approach our work is to find practical intervention points. And, you know, so Claire, to your question, I think some of the momentum has dissipated. I think we have, I don't think we are seeing radical changes in the way that we had hoped, but I actually do feel like through working with donor champions in these systems, through, you know, kind of bringing them along, through the work that our working group is doing around creating processes to help local organizations understand more empowering ways to finance their own work that create sustainability. I don't think the shift is going to be, you know, catalyzed even by a global pandemic overnight. But I do think there are entry points, and some of them, you know, it's feeding that work into donors who do really recognize that this paradigm is problematic. You know, I think there is still the will to change the paradigm, and we have to really find where those entry points are. And some of them, as you noted, can be as simple as asking more pointed questions instead of asking for a global South partner in an application. Define what you mean, create parameters around that, and hold yourselves accountable to those parameters. So I do really believe that there are some relatively simple, you know, ways that we could shift the system in a powerful way.
Thanks, Riva. And I want to ask Una to pick up on some of those points, and particularly, you know, as Riva, you're suggesting, obviously these things do take time, although one would like to think that a global pandemic would be able to catalyze and accelerate maybe. But Una, you know, you're looking through your indices, obviously, at the nature of interventions, you know, and to Anik's earlier point that nobody wants to fund the hard stuff, social justice stuff. Nobody wants to fund stuff that might upset local government. And yet, if you're not funding stuff that might upset local government, you might not be empowering local communities. So there is that real conundrum, isn't there? That if, you know, as Riva said, you've got good people that want to go in and do good stuff, but you come up against this dilemma, especially in the global south. Are you going to challenge the norm? Are you going to challenge potential government reform? Or are you going to say, well, look, I can just get more traction if I put my money into education and health and their existing programs run by INGOs? You know, how do we deal with that dilemma?
Yes, I think you've raised a really important point. To that, I'd say that I actually see quite a bit of change taking place at the macro level. When we look at a lot of large funders, especially US-based funders, but even European funders, there is a lot more opportunity and a lot more attention to the need to create these new mechanisms for funding grassroots organizations, and specifically groups like the Ford Foundation, a Black Women's Fund. We have support, I think, new funds that are being set up in the US. More than half of American cities now have a standalone racial equity fund that is designed to help support organizations. We've also been tracking Americans and their giving specifically to racial justice. And we saw a significant uptick both for everyday Americans and high net worth donors in their willingness to fund racial and social justice, almost a quarter of high net worth Americans. And when we look at large gifts to a lot of organizations who have previously not attracted large gifts, so historically Black colleges and universities had record increases in funding, I think that presents an opportunity. The question is, how do we sustain that momentum? And just sort of put that aside and also emphasize that there is also the component of local philanthropy. We look at sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, the Middle East. We also see a lot of capacity taking place, specifically with the pandemic. There's been a rise in new ways of giving, social media powered giving, technology-driven giving, crowdfunding, impact investing, blockchain, and local communities and grassroots organizations now have opportunities to raise resources. When it comes to new sources of giving, I want to emphasize from our Global Philanthropy Tracker that $68 billion is cross-border giving in 2018, but remittances from international migration are close to $500 million. So basically, $1 billion, I should clarify, $500 billion. And most people are quite surprised to hear the scale of that. My point is diaspora communities can also be an important resource. As we think about shifting the power, going back to this idea, there's also how do we build on local capacity to essentially create the infrastructure for organizations to raise their own philanthropic capital, because in many parts of the world, there is the rise of high net worth donors and their interest in philanthropy has grown. Diaspora communities are an important resource, and technology is making it possible for small organizations to reach out to communities and raise funds. Obviously micro philanthropy, but certainly we've seen that be very important around racial and social justice in the US especially.
Thanks, Una. You raise a very important point. So excellent that you're seeing an upturn in investment in racial equity and social justice in the US. Let's hope that, like so many US trends, this one also gets exported, perhaps one of the healthier ones. So that's great to hear. And of course, you know, we have seen during the pandemic, and I always think, you know, leadership is such an important element that sometimes we're not really sure how to define it, and it sounds a bit flaky. But when you see organizations like Ford Foundation came up time and time again when we were doing our research as an organization that had agreed to radically change the way it was dispersing capital. I mean, that was, you know, it was really a great example. And then, of course, they went off and the bond issue as well, which was great, you know, really kind of innovative thinking. And then you have, of course, McKinsey Scott, who I believe has quite explicitly focused on, you know, notwithstanding all the issues we have around billionaire philanthropists, that's another seminar, but at least she has agreed to spend all her money, spend down. She's agreed to give, I think, the majority in core funding, unrestricted, and I believe to quite a lot of sort of grassroots social injustice entities, sort of the smaller, non-usual suspects. So it is great to hear that things are changing. And of course, if large institutions or high-profile leaders do these things, then it does help influence others. But I want to just switch again to Anik. In Indonesia, you touched on this. So we have seen, for example, the growth of high net worth philanthropists in Indonesia, increasingly building their own philanthropic journeys. And also, as Una mentioned, and great that you mentioned it, you know, the technology piece. So big data, the blockchain, something that we absolutely saw, particularly in Africa, in our research of how people were using accelerated digitization to connect across Africa. But if any of these work in Africa, so, you know, you have this thing, you have to fly to Paris to get to the other side of Africa, whereas a lot of people we interviewed for our COVID-19 report said, wow, we used to do that stuff, and now actually we just get on Zoom and we speak more regularly, and there's, you know, translation functions, so we don't even have that language thing. So we had multiple examples of people, particularly in Africa, saying, because it's so huge, of course, how they were connecting now through accelerated digitization and also sharing data. So even if it was just through WhatsApp groups. And recently, and shame on me, I can't remember if it was, somebody said that they had actually capacity to issue grants through a WhatsApp voice message. That will come back to me. So get that for simplifying. You can record a WhatsApp voice message as to why you need the grant and how much you need. So I think that's an important piece. So to you, Anik, what are you seeing in Indonesia in terms of the growth of high net worth philanthropists, private sector philanthropists? Are they willing to work with small grassroots organization, and is technology helping?
Okay, thank you, Claire.
I'm sorry, Anik, just before you start, I wanted to mention to everybody that we will go to questions after Anik's intervention. So if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A rather than the chat, and we'll come to them shortly. Over to you, Anik. Thanks.
Okay. So Claire, actually, if we talk the same institution, the philanthropy organization, our organization is one of the founder, because at that time we imagine that there is a private sector or business sector with the NGOs can collide and support each other. But again, the issue itself sometimes forbid our NGO friends to and they have to have some tools to really screen with corporate they can work. For example, for the environmental, maybe they can work with certain organization that they know is destroy the environment. And the fact is, in Indonesia, more because it's our experience to the corporate that approach us is the big corporate, which we cannot collaborate with them because of our ethics. That's the first. So yeah, it's a long way to go, but I have to be optimistic, and then that's why I really see that the regulation from the government is really important to the sustainability of NGO working for human rights and social justice. If not, then the step is will be very slow. Secondly, about the technology, we also doing that because of the power. Also, we met with one international platform, and then we think that okay, we already tried the crowdfunding platform in Indonesia, which is again not really successful to be applied in the social justice issues, but. Then we always, as an Indonesian, I think I learned that we have always a way around. So so we think at that time, okay, let's try doing with the international tools. I mean, the international platform, because now our target is not Indonesian, but it's strange, you know, because we commit to have a local resource to support our struggle. But now again, we ask for the international community, individual even, to support our cause, because there is the history of the philanthropy in Indonesia, which is I think affecting also the intention of people to give to the structural issue. So if you notice that now the philanthropy in Indonesia is more based on the religious base, and sometimes they have the regulation that they are not really complying with our values, because our grant to local people is beyond all the race, the ethnicity, the religious. So that's another point. But yeah, we really hope with the technology, and I saw a lot of young people, feminist, young movement in Indonesia using technology to get support for what they are doing, for doing their campaign. And I think as a 25 years old organization, I think that's the culture that we have to learn. So now we recruit more young people to join with our organization to bring new culture. But I think it cannot ourselves doing that. We need someone from outside to help to be there in support us to bring the investment to change the culture, because it's not easy because before we also have a culture because we support the human rights victims, so we have to work underground. And some of the character is still are in us. We cannot really very open to the public saying that okay, we support this organization, and because we are also working for the victim of the conflict, and there is also the campaign about this group. The victim group is always reproducing, even in the new era of transformative transformation in Indonesia. So yes, we believe on technology, and we try hard to do that. We revisit our website, but we need people especially to really take care of our technological base, and it's not a cheap. Claire, I can told you it's not easy. So yeah, we are in that kind of process. I hope I answer you.
Great, thanks, Anik. And you mentioned again a couple of important points. So you mentioned that, of course, some of the challenges are, whilst there might be increasingly large organizations that want to work with grassroots communities, sometimes the grassroots communities don't want to work with them because they bring a bad name. And I think that's an important point. And I've certainly heard that from a couple of large corporate foundations who have said to me that they are increasingly struggling to work with local communities because local communities are finding their voice and saying, actually, we don't want to work with, you know, whoever that may be. I don't want to name sectors, but so I think that's, and I like the fact that you raise again the important point of youth. So my philosophy has always been, if you want to digitize fast, you just hire a bunch of young people, and then Luddites like myself can just let them get on with it. But I think it's interesting you point out, of course, these movements, you know, these movements around local voice and new generations simply not accepting not to be heard, because they are digital natives and they're used to being heard and they want feedback and they're used to having voice, global voice from the day they were born. So I think that is definitely another aspect of optimism and hope for change that I hope we are getting across in this discussion. Since it's our last, I want us to go out on a positive note. But let's turn to our questions. So you guys, lovely audience, have been voting them up. So I'm going to start with the one that has the most votes thus far, which is from Namrata, who works with European Philanthropy that is looking to develop capacity and strengthen supports towards its existing grantees and capacity strengthening for local political leaders and youth. Okay, what we were just talking about. So her question is, what would your recommendations be for how we think about capacity strengthening while being conscious and sensitive to shifting the power? Riva, do you want to have a shot at that one? And then happy for others to add.
Yes, I do. That's a great question. Thank you, Namrata. So that brings to mind two things. But I was in Kosovo a couple of years ago working on an evaluation, and one of the local women's organizations said to me, we are a recipient of, in this case, it was USAID funding, and they keep sending international accounting experts to help us build capacity around our accounting systems. And she said, USA didn't invent accounting. I don't understand. We're very familiar with the processes of accounting here. And we also believe this is important. So I think, first, do you support local experts to provide that technical expertise, and this is also to local organizations. Do you have a roster of local experts, that could potentially, why are we sending in international, why are we pretending like it's only international experts that understand things like accounting? And so, I think, again, that's a relatively straightforward question to ask within your organization. Are we supporting local experts? Do we have a roster of local experts? And who determined what the capacity building priorities are? Did those come from I would hope that those came from consultation, from direct requests with the young people, with the organizations that you're working with. So those are my two thoughts.
If only. Thank you, Riva. It really is about asking the right questions, isn't it? Great. So we have a few more questions here. One from which I'm going to pitch to you, Una, although there's one specifically directed at you. So maybe we'll go for that one first and say we'll have 2 votes. But let's go to Casey's question to Una and other panelists. What would you suggest as ways to improving the enabling environment for local philanthropy and local fundraising? Should we ask big northern donors to demand restrictions on philanthropy be lifted? Or should we talk to the banking community about not stopping cross-border transactions? That's a great one for you.
I love that question because it's really at the heart of all of the work we do at the Lilly Family School. I think one of the findings that I just want to lift up from the Global Philanthropy Tracker is that philanthropy is everywhere. Every single country, community that we study in the North, in the Global South, small, large countries have a tradition around philanthropy. What we often lack is the infrastructure, the enabling environment, and in some countries and regions, it's simply difficult to give money. So people may be very willing to write those checks to make those contributions, but there are restrictions in place. And with a lot of the anti-terrorism legislation that was passed post 9/11 in the US and around the world, it's become much harder to engage in cross-border giving. And under the, you could say some countries have over enforced some of those laws where even smaller dollar amounts are scrutinized or stopped. And we have many countries around the world that have actually passed legislation that restricts or curtails foreign funding, the foreign funding laws. What we have seen, though, is that there can be a positive shift in that and making it easier, not just to give across borders, but even domestically. I'll give you an example. Nigeria wanted to pass a fundraising requirement where any organization that wants to have a fundraiser has to register with the government before it can engage in fundraising, which means alumni groups, small civil society organizations, large organizations would be subject to the same restrictions. There was such an uproar on social media lobbying the government, and that law was not passed at all. So that is a very simple legislation that, with the action of civil society and nonprofits and the NGO community, would have affected even myself as someone who's involved in alumni organizations and so forth. So what I would say is that there's a lot of work to be done. It should not be so difficult to give money, and not just locally, but across borders. And we have a role to play in that solution. That means working within local communities, local governments, to make sure that the infrastructure is in place, the ease of giving, whether it's tax incentives or just these kinds of onerous and burdensome regulatory requirements, reducing those requirements. Many years ago, there was, you might remember, the World Bank had a cost of doing business study, and they found that just the time that it would take to register a business was sometimes years in some countries. With our Global Philanthropy Environment Index, we see that many nonprofits have 5 or 6 or 7 government agencies that have to sign off before an organization can actually be in operation. So I think we in the sector have a role to play in making sure that those onerous, burdensome regulatory requirements are reduced. Certainly, there are good reasons for having the cross-border scrutiny, but we do not want these unintended policy consequences as well.
Absolutely, and I have so many of those examples of that as well, of, you know, governments insisting on how many people you have on your board, governments insisting on scrutinizing incoming grants and outgoing grants, governments insisting on seeing even your communications plan as a foundation before you, I mean, it is, but I think there's also an onus on us, right, to explain the opportunity of philanthropic capital, and maybe when that really becomes clear that, oh, actually this is a source of additional funding and innovation. And we're seeing that due to COVID, that
yes,
hopefully things will improve. Great, thanks for that, Una. We have a lot of questions and only 35 minutes left, so we're going to try and get through as many as we can. So I have a question here for you, Anik, from Aliza Fan, who is asking, how do we make it possible for big foundations to fund small local organizations? I know you have experience of big donors funding small organizations. How do you do that successfully? What needs to be in place?
Okay, thank you, Claire. Thank you for the question. Yeah, so Indonesia for Humanity is a national organization, actually, and I think when I try to answer that question, it's also bring me to the position of when we talk about local community. What we mean by local? I mean, because like I told before, that when you talk about the local problem that have to be solved by the local organization, yes, it can be also. But what about the local problem that the root cause is in the national level? So I'm talking about there should be someone in the national that can give you a leverage and then can give you to a broader networking to your struggle for voicing your local needs to the national level. And then, of course, I'm not saying that they cannot do by themselves to the national, but access is something that we realize between the district and between the national level is different. So why ICA can get that trust? I think because we also in the national, and we also have what is the most important. We understand what is the management tools that donor want us to have. Like the founder of our organization commit in the first year of our establishment is we have to be audited by external auditor, and now it's become expensive, Claire, and then less donor want to support the external audit for organization, but because it's our commitment, so we really try hard to have a small saving and then or ask for the innovative way. There is a time when we really have no donor, I mean a very thin donor, and we ask for a pro bono service from our auditor friends. So it can be solve the problem. So I think because donors still really need some tool, of course, to measure they fund. So we have also comply with. So we have to be more flexible, but we have also to have a professional in managing the grant. So
it all goes back to that the capacity issue, doesn't it, Anik? As you said, yeah. You know, how do we build that local capacity so that international donors are willing to give, and yet at the same time, how do we build that without creating this huge burden on local organizations? As Riva was saying, you know, getting them to adopt processes that perhaps might not be relevant.
Sorry, I have one addition point.
Sure, go ahead.
So with the position when you have the trusted organization in national, you can also in the position to to make your local partner less burdened with all the administrative thing from the donor. So we do our role as a negotiator to the donor with, and then we are like a buffer when you want to give to the victim organization.
Right. That's interesting you mentioned that, because we've been hearing so much more recently about the role of intermediaries, and I think the fact that you use the word negotiation is important. Because in the private sector, when we're talking about commercial contracts and commercial funding, we always talk about negotiation. And yet historically in philanthropy, there's always been this kind of thing, like someone's willing to give you money, just take the money. And yet increasingly, of course, there is a need to negotiate and get those local needs and local voices heard. So excellent point. Thank you, Anik. I'm going to try and get through a few more questions before I ask the panelists. And just to give them advance warning, I'm actually going to ask you, since our theme has morphed into optimism, I'm going to ask all three of you to share your thoughts on what makes you optimistic about the year ahead before we close out. But in the interim, so think about that.
Claire, could I just add a comment on this, on Anik's reflection and the issue of intermediaries, just to our thinking about the system and where are pain points and levers in the system. I just wanted to note that through another project with the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict, RFF has been doing a lot of thinking about this issue of intermediaries, as are many others, Oxfam, UK, Peace Direct. And I think that this is another place where, to Anik's point, there's a lot of room to define better criteria. The role of an intermediary is not going away. So to the question of how to get funds directly to local organizations, through many conversations with donors, a lot of funders don't have the capacity to manage 600 small grants to local organizations. And so it's just very unlikely that that role is going to disappear. But we think that there's a lot of space to shape that role, and both donors and intermediary organizations need to be held accountable to being better partners to local organizations. And so how would we define a set of criteria? And the community philanthropy movement, for example, is doing that in some ways. They have just received a large amount of funding from the Dutch government to support community philanthropy networks in 7 countries. What does it mean for them to play that? They would not like the term intermediary, but for them to play that supporting role where they are part of the architecture, really helping to build local capacities, in this case for community philanthropy. So I just wanted to note, I think that's really one of these levers where we can do a lot more thinking, and donors can hold themselves better accountable to funding intermediary organizations that are supportive partners to local organizations. And organizations like Anik's have a lot to say about what that means, from her perspective, being a recipient of these funds. Thank you.
Thanks, Riva. Very important point you make. And I like the fact that you consistently say, we've got to work with what we have, be realistic, essentially, about what can we change and what can't we change, and what can we change radically. And, I guess it's a case of pick your battles. So here's one for Una. Una, you were talking about, this increase to more marginalized communities, increase of giving. Mike is asking, what are the opportunities for the shift the power discussions in relation to disability sector, given that persons with disability are among the most marginalized? Are you seeing any movement in that space?
I think that's a very good point. When we talk about marginalized groups, there has been, for too long, perhaps, we've focused on one group, or we focused on one particular community, but we haven't necessarily unpacked all the components of what it means to be marginalized. And that can be gender, it can be race and ethnicity, it can be religion, it can be disability, LGBT status. And then we also have to remember that there are intersections. Someone can be a racial or ethnic minority and from a disabled background and so forth. What I am seeing, though, is a real interest in understanding what marginalization means, more conversation about it in the funding community. And with disability in particular, that is not an area that funders have historically paid attention to, especially in the Global South. And there is a lot more, I'd say, conversation. It has to now translate into funding But here, this is where grassroots organizations have an advantage. Many of them have been working on these issues, whether it's, for example, a group that I'm very familiar with in Nigeria, it's called Niger Wives, has for decades translated books into Braille for the blind population, where no other funder was paying attention to this. And now, as global funders and other high net worth donors are looking into these questions, they have opportunities to work with organizations who've been doing this for decades and benefit really from that type of new partnership. So my suggestion as funders start to think about these new areas of funding, racial and social justice, disability, many of these marginalized communities, understand that there are groups that have a track record, have a long history of working on these issues, and be intentional about this is what Shift the Power means. These organizations have expertise. Work with them, partner with them. And here's another point, which I'm quite sensitive to: pay them for their expertise, compensate them. So if they're going to serve in an advisory group or in a consulting role, think about a stipend or honorarium if your budget permits. This is for the funding community, because that's another piece of this shift of power that very often when experts from outside of, say, the global south are brought into projects, there is an understanding that there'll be a consulting fee or an honorarium or expert consultation compensation. But when working with local leaders and grassroots organizations, that understanding may not be there. So here's another call to action from that question as you seek to expand the groups that are worked with and bring historically marginalized groups to the table, which is long overdue. There's also, I think, a parallel question. There are groups that are doing this work already, and funders need to be intentional about working with them.
Yeah, and that whole point about look to see who's doing it already, right, Una, so that we get scale and these things can become a mainstream approach, building on each other's work, very important. Thank you for that. We are running out of time. We're going to try and squeeze in maybe just one or two more questions, because I would like to hear from our panelists as we close out. You know, what are their thoughts for the year ahead? What's going to change? What keeps you optimistic? But specifically now I'm going to go to picking up actually on the points you mentioned, tools, but I'm going to give this one to Anik, since Anik, obviously you're working very much with local social movements. So Timothy is asking, how can philanthropic organizations support local actors, like he's suggesting social movements, so not necessarily big institutional organizations, so what he's saying, their outside track tactics can catalyze more change. So I guess you're saying, Timothy, these organizations, social movements, often can bring more change than big institutionalized ones or civil society organizations. How can philanthropic organizations find those people and fund them? Because it's true, if you're a donor, you tend to go to the larger institutions, you know about them, they're high profile, they have a website, and you might miss out on grassroots leaders who are actually driving radical transformational change.
I need to think. No, yeah, actually, yeah, good question. I think our experience is proof that it's very not very easy to be recognized by the international. Like I told you, we already have 25 years, and I think Una or Riva never heard about Indonesia for Humanity or even Clare in Cambridge. So for us, so it's a long way. Actually, I cannot give a direct answer, but like maybe it's also refer for what I'm saying before that you can start with. So I think if you want to work in one country, you have to understand the context. And I think 20 years ago, we still have a global north having people, the staff of the donors who have a really like an ownership of the issue of this country, and then like they even can talk the local language, so they can understand faster about who and how to work in this kind of country. And we are now lack of this kind of people. So first they have the context, they also have the ownership of the issue that they want to work. And I think you can find more easily to recognize which is really have a real work in the field, and because all of this is a networking. And also, I think that's also the role of the national intermediary organization also to bring the voice of the local, because we know the context. But again, I'm really feel unfortunate because before our establishment was supported by the North funders actually, but then there is an evaluation about how in the long term they have to work in Indonesia, and actually the evaluation said strengthen the local organization, strengthen the intermediary organization base that born by the movement itself. But what they are doing is they open the office in Indonesia. Because of the money from the global North was reduced, that's also the excuse for them, because we have to hurt closer to the local voice. So we need set up our office. So that's the phenomenon of the donor from the North, and also the phenomenon that they use. Even they put. I already heard about some of the panelists in the session before said that development sector is a business sector. That's why now they send the contractor, which is in the form of a profit company. We call it contractor, or rather than they working and strengthen the local civil society research organization or grant making organization. So what I want to say that to recognize whether this is really a work for your country or they have rooted in the community, is you have to understand the context, and you have to see who's really born from the movement.
Absolutely. It goes back to the point of, do your research and ask the right questions. Una, I know you wanted to come in on that, but then very quickly, because I'm going to then give you all just 2 minutes to give me, or a minute and a half to give me your closing thoughts. So go ahead, Una.
I just wanted to say that infrastructure organizations, community foundations can be really helpful in curating and organizing these grassroots organizations in a way that makes it easier for larger funders to get involved. In the US, for example, community foundations have taken the lead on putting together information about Black-led social justice, racial justice organizations, so that funders who want to support these movements or organizations, many of them may not even be large enough to have a website and so forth, can find them. So I do think that we've seen that work quite well, especially last year in 2020 and even 2021, where funders were intentionally seeking out those opportunities to give. So that was just for those of you who are involved in community foundations and I'd say collective umbrella groups, this could be a space that is ripe for, I think, expansion.
Yeah, absolutely. And that relates to some of the discussions that we have in our executive education program, where we're always looking at how you identify the right partners, how you do the research up front before your intervention. I think in our sector, it's super easy to just jump in and surmise what the problem is rather than actually talking to local grassroots communities. And it's something, so in our program, it's where we're essentially trying to support the growth of Global South philanthropists, many of whom are coming in to start their journey, that really is the starting point. How do you look at local communities? How do you look at local needs? And indeed, do join us. We have our next program running in March. Jack has just kindly shared the link there. So if anybody's interested in finding out more about that, that really is a critical component of the program, identifying where to intervene before you jump in. Next one running in March 28th. So now, Una, why don't you then just give us your closing thoughts? Are you optimistic for the year ahead? And then I will ask Riva and Anik the same question.
Yes, I am absolutely optimistic. Watching the data, and this is the perspective that I bring, we've seen an expansion in generosity across the globe, and not just in traditional funding ways with philanthropists, high net worth donors, but everyday donors as well, giving to organizations of all different types. In addition, we've seen innovation in probably a way that we have not seen in our lifetime, with new tools, new vehicles. I think with all of this, there's also a bit of a call to action. There's this generosity, there's this expansion in new ways of giving, but the regulatory environment has not kept up. And so for all of us here today, I think we need to continue to push for an enabling environment that allows people to step up, to continue to step up and do the work that needs to be done without these onerous and burdensome regulatory requirements that impede and constrain generosity, not just across borders, but even within national borders. So I am very optimistic, and thank you again.
Excellent. Thank you, Una. Riva, optimistic for the future? Year ahead?
Absolutely. And I feel like Una and I should be regularly in touch, because her optimism is inspiring. So just, I just wanted to make 3 quick points in closing, and building on what Una said. I am optimistic because the landscape of providers of capital is changing. I think you all underscored that. And, young consumers care about human rights issues. They care about, labor standards. And so I think there is space to continue to map that landscape and better understand the strategic advantage of institutional philanthropy, of bilateral funders, of corporate foundations, of high net worth individuals. How can each of these different actors support different types of activities? So that was one point. Just the second quick thing, again, to what Una noted, continue to push on innovation, and I think my optimism is a little tempered in that I don't know that I see funders in the spaces that I work in really investing in research and development and investing in new ways of financing local organizations. And this relates to the third point that I wanted to make. There are great practices out there. Local organizations are finding interesting ways of getting resources to support their work, and part of our goal at RFF is to really lift up those examples and help mainstream them, to show funders that this work, again, we didn't invent any of this. It is already happening. How do we, show funders that this is possible? And so I think, those are sort of the optimistic, and Avila Lillian noted in the chat, I appreciated examples of values-based intermediaries. Again, there are examples all over the place of great work already being done. So, how do we continue to find those examples and lift them up?
Absolutely. Very excellent point. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. The wheel is there. We just need to lift it up. Anik, a minute from you, please, on your closing thoughts on if you're optimistic for the year ahead.
Yes, of course, because I heard a decade ago that Indonesia have this kind of shift the power, but it's only in Indonesia. But now I met all of you here, and then thank you. So I think I'm very optimistic about that, and you all are our resource of optimism. And as a community foundation, we are also an activist activist fund. Which work in national, and also we also try to engage with international to support what we are doing. Like we are joined with the Foundation for Peace Network. So and we talk about the digital and the young people, and I think we are on the right track, even though the way is still very long. But I'm very optimistic. Thank you.
Thank you, Anik. So brilliant to hear from all of you. So Una, optimistic because things are happening. We are investing in much more needy areas. We're listening to the market. Riva, like you said, communities are already doing this stuff. Let's get behind them and share that and share local practice instead of always international best practice, local practice. And Anik, great, you raised the point that, of course, the more we create these networks, the more we connect people from across the globe, more we can lift profiles. And indeed, that is very much the essence of the Shift the Power series here at the Center for Strategic Philanthropy at Cambridge University, is that we absolutely want to amplify the voices from the Global South so we can maximize the impact of this massively growing sector, and create communities that support each other. So as the last in our series for the year, I think it's been absolutely fascinating for us here at the center to meet just such inspiring voices, and all of you here today are no exception. So I'm hugely optimistic just because I see firsthand there are amazing leaders in our sector, and to see 3 powerful female leaders is even more inspiring and makes me even more optimistic. And I think as a Center for Strategic Philanthropy, we will continue to keep this conversation going. We invite you all to stay connected to us through our social media networks, join our events, join our executive education program, connect with these amazing leaders that you see in front of you online, through LinkedIn. I'm sorry that we didn't get to all the questions, but please connect with us outside of this event and we will do our best to answer them. I hope that this, for our closing session, has given you all hope for the way ahead, for our sector, for emerging market philanthropy. I know for Riva, Anik and Una, this is certainly not the end of our collaboration, and we will continue to talk with you about how we can maximize impact in the global south in philanthropy. So a huge thank you to all of you, to our audience today, and we will see you next year. Thank you and bye-bye.